Welcome to the Persian Wars. Now, the Persian Wars were a pair of conflicts in 490 and then 480 BCE, which pitted the Achaemenid Empire against the united Greeks. These conflicts were formative for the self-identity of the Greeks and ushered in the classical period. The Achaemenids were also called the First Persian Empire. It was an ancient Iranian empire based in Western Asia, founded by a figure named Cyrus the Great. They spoke the Old Persian language. It was written using cuneiform script common to many languages in the Near East. Interestingly, Persian was in the same language family as Greek. It was Indo-European, though they are not the closest branches of the family. The Achaemenids are primarily known to us as the antagonists of the Greeks in the Persian Wars. This is problematic for us because we would like to have more evidence and more knowledge of the Achaemenids from within their own culture. Now, the expansion and the creation of the Persian Empire is attributed to a figure named Cyrus the Great. In 546 BCE, this Cyrus the Great conquered Lydia and their king Croesus, whom we have met multiple times before. The Lydian capital, Sardis, becomes the most important Persian administrative center in Asia Minor, the area closest to Greece. This conquest of Sardis brings Cyrus into control of the Greek cities of Ionia, Miletus, Ephesus, Colophon, and others. This fact will prove to be very important in the Ionian Revolt and the Persian Wars. Cyrus expands and unifies a very heterogeneous empire. His holdings included peoples from Syria, Palestine, Babylonia from around 539, Assyria, Persia, and many parts of Anatolia. There are also some further conquests under his son and successors Cambyses, who's mainly famous for conquering Egypt. Cyrus was the first Persian king to bring together territories into an imperial framework with a structure. This also would be an influence for the Athenian Empire later. Religious tolerance was a part of the Achaemenid culture, and it also was a part of governing such a large empire. For example, the story of the return of the Jewish exiles of Babylonia and the rebuilding of their famous Second Temple in Jerusalem is an example. The main Greek and Judean sources, that is the Book of Ezra, present Cyrus as a conqueror welcomed by the local inhabitants. His royal residence was at Pasargadae. The Persian capital was later moved to Persepolis by his successor Darius. This is also where Cyrus's tomb was constructed. He was buried there by his son Cambyses. Cyrus's tomb is about 1 kilometer southwest of the palaces at Pasargadae. It most likely dates from 539 to 529 BCE, somewhere around in there. This is a map of the extent of the Persian Empire. It was huge. It extended from the Balkans and Eastern Europe in the west to the Indus Valley in India in the east, which was larger than any previous empire in recorded history, spanning 5.5 million square kilometers. Famously, Darius built a specific road to facilitate rapid communication through this heterogeneous and huge empire. The road stretched from Susa to Sardis. Cyrus's mounted couriers were supposed to travel 1,677 miles, or 2,699 kilometers, from Susa to Sardis in only 9 days. The journey took 90 days on foot. Herodotus tells us that there's nothing in the world that travels faster than these Persian couriers. Herodotus also describes the Persian messengers. Neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor gloom of night stays these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds. This was later inscribed on the New York post office and serves as an inspiration for the motto of the post office. Here is a list of Persian monarchs. We have Cyrus the Great, who ruled from 559 to 530. Then we have Cambyses from 530 to 522 BCE. Then we have Darius from 521 to 486, and Xerxes from 486 to 465 BCE. His successor Artaxerxes ruled from 465 to 424 BCE. The empire lasted until the reign of Alexander the Great. These Persian kings created a lasting administrative system, which included 20 satrapies or provinces. The satrapies were part of a complicated taxation system and a centralized government centered on Persepolis. Each satrapy or province paid an annual tribute to the great king, but otherwise the Persians allowed local forms of administration and local governors to act and proceed as they had before. Of course, there were federal, you might say, bureaucrats and spies, that is, the eyes and ears of the king throughout the Persian Empire, but generally the great king, Cyrus or Darius or whoever it might be, let the parts of his empire rule autonomously. Now, the Persian king was the great king. He was an absolute ruler, but he was not a tyrant, because his authority was constitutional and traditional. All tribute from the provinces came to him personally. All military judicial authority stemmed from him. There were no assemblies or councils which had the power to enact laws or dictate policy. The term proskinesis refers to the requirement that all were required to prostrate themselves when before the king. This differences between types of governments was stark for the Greeks. The Greeks believed the Persian king considered his subjects slaves. On the other hand, the Greek social and political system represented freedom for the individual, or so they thought. Persepolis was the residence of the Achaemenid monarchs. The royal quarters, which were built on a hill terrace, contained a treasury and multiple symmetrically planned palaces, some with immense square columnar halls. In the 19th century, archaeologists discovered that it was Darius who leveled the huge rock terrace and began the Great Apadana, or audience hall. The Apadana is the most famous building on the site. Persepolis was finally completed by Xerxes and his successor, Artaxerxes. Artaxerxes finished Persepolis with the building of the Hall of 100 Pillars, and then built his own palace complex nearby. Encircling the entire complex was a fortification wall and a great gate and stairway that led up to the terrace. The bas-reliefs of these palaces are among the finest extant examples of Achaemenid art. These include the audience reliefs originally flanked by lions attacking bulls and 23 delegations of tribute bearers. The beginning of the Persian Wars was the Ionian Revolt. The background to the revolt was that the Persians had set up tyrants to govern the Greek cities of Asia Minor from around 550 to 500 BCE. From the Achaemenid perspective, this simply meant that they were governors of their satrapies. This made these Greek cities easier to deal with and to direct. We're told by Herodotus that these tyrants, having the backing of the Persian satraps or the provincial governors and the great king, often took the opportunity to rule violently and tyrannically. Herodotus tells us that the great king Darius uses this revolt of the Greek cities as actual grounds for his war, his casus belli, the reason for his invasion. In 513 BCE, Darius's expedition versus the barbarian Scythians to the north fails. In 499 BCE, the Ionians revolt from Persian rule. These puppet tyrants are deposed, and isonomia, a term which means equality before the law, is declared by a certain Aristagoras, the tyrant of Miletus who had betrayed the Persians. The tipping point for Aristagoras' betrayal of the Persians was his failed attack versus the island of Naxos, in which he embroiled the Athenians. The Ionians marched on Sardis. The city was burnt, including famous temples of both the Persians and the Greeks. This act would spark later Persian retribution in the form of temple burning in Greece, and was considered actually by the Greeks themselves as extremely violent and irreligious. After the revolt, Aristagoras pleads with both Sparta and Athens to send aid to the Ionian cities of Anatolia. Athens agrees, Sparta does not. Why does Athens take part in the Ionian Revolt? Perhaps if we take an economic view of the matter, it was their interests which were at stake in order to maintain their control of the Black Sea grain trade. The Battle of Lade occurred in 494 BCE off the coast of Asia Minor. The Greeks can't unify among themselves. They bicker and are defeated. Miletus is sacked. Women and kids are enslaved and deported to the Persian capital. The Athenians across the Aegean Sea are touched by the fall of Miletus. Actually, a tragedy is written at this time called the Fall of Miletus by a certain Phrynichus. After the fall of Miletus by Phrynichus is promulgated at Athens and people are overwhelmed with the horror of this event, historical titles of tragedies are banned. They were too emotional. After the Ionian Revolt, Darius decides to invade directly as a continuation of the Battle of Lade. In 492, Darius's general Mardonius leads an invasion force, and his fleet is wrecked off Mount Athos in the north of Greece. In 490, Darius decides to mount a new expedition. In this new expedition, there were perhaps 20,000 men. Maybe 200 or more ships. This is a large force. The Persians bring with them the exiled Athenian tyrant Hippias to reinstall at Athens. Argos, Thebes, Aegina, and all the Aegean islands submit to the Persian king Darius's demand for earth and water for submission. The Persian army moves by fleet to Boeotia and burns Eretria for their role in burning Sardis. Then they descend on Attica and arrive at the plain of Marathon. The Athenians ask the Spartans for aid, but the Spartans cannot come, or so they say, to the defense of Greece, because they're celebrating an important religious festival for Apollo called the Carneia. Now, some believe that the Spartans actually could have come, but just didn't want to, and some believe that they couldn't come at all. Herodotus tells us about a fascinating dream that the Pisistrated Hippias has upon his arrival back in his old stomping grounds at Attica. So they waited for the full moon, while the foreigners were guided to Marathon by Hippias, son of Pisistratus. The previous night, Hippias had a dream in which he slept with his mother. He supposed from the dream that he would return from exile to Athens, recover his rule, and end his days an old man in his own country. Thus he believed from the dream. Then, as a guide, he anchored the ships that had put ashore at Marathon. As he was tending to this, he happened to sneeze and cough more violently than usual. Since he was an elderly man, most of his teeth were loose, and he lost one of them by the force of his cough. It fell into the sand, and he expended much effort in looking for it, but the tooth could not be found. He groaned aloud and said to those standing by him, "This land is not ours. We will not be able to subdue it. My tooth holds whatever share of it was mine." Basically, Hippias supposed that the dream had in this way come true. At the Battle of Marathon, the Greeks were outnumbered at least 2-1. The two armies were encamped right next to each other. The Spartans were supposed to arrive at the full moon, and some wanted to just wait for those Spartans. But then it was discovered that some Persian troops and cavalry were missing from the force. This makes some of the Athenian scouts believe that the Persians were actually embarking on some sort of scheme to sail around Attica to Phaleron, the port of Athens. There was a deadlock in what to do. There was bickering and turmoil. The Athenian Miltiades makes a famous speech to persuade the Polemarch, an important magistrate at Athens, named Callimachus. Miltiades wants the Athenians to join battle immediately. Now, the Athenian board of generals were of a divided opinion. Some advocated not fighting because they were too few to attack the army of the Persians. Others, including the famous Miltiades, advocated fighting. Thus they were at odds, and finally the immediate battle prevailed. This is how Herodotus tells the story. Quote, "The Athenian generals were of divided opinion, some advocating not fighting because there were too few to attack the army of the Persians, others, including Miltiades, advocating fighting. An 11th man had a vote, chosen by lot to be Polemarch of Athens, and by ancient custom the Athenians had made his vote of equal weight with the generals. Callimachus was Polemarch at this time. Miltiades approached him, and he said, 'Callimachus, it is now in your hands to enslave Athens or to make her free, and thereby leave behind for all posterity a memorial such as not even Harmodius and Aristogeiton left. Now the Athenians have come to their greatest danger since they first came into being, and if we surrender, it is clear what we will suffer when handed over to Hippias. But if the city prevails, it will take first place among the Greek cities. I will tell you how this can happen, and how the deciding voice on these matters has devolved upon you. The 10 generals are of divided opinion, some urging to attack, others urging not to. If we do not attack now, I expect that great strife will fall upon and shake the spirit of the Athenians, leading them to surrender. But if we attack now, before anything unsound corrupts the Athenians, we can win the battle. That is, if the gods treat us fairly. All this concerns and depends on you in this way. If you vote with me, your country will be free and your city the first in Greece. But if you side with those eager to avoid battle, you will have the opposite to all the good things I described." At the Battle of Marathon, the Athenian flanks were deep, tightly packed, while the center was left thinner in a classic pincher formation. The Persians aggressively pursue the center, pushing it forward, but the Persian flanks are then routed by the Athenian flanks, and the Persian center begins to retreat. So the Athenian flanks push up and pressure the Persian center until even the center fled back towards the Persian ships and the marshes. It's unclear exactly where the fleet was positioned along the coast, but it makes sense to think that the Persian fleet massed closer to where the camp was, and that the camp was simply beyond the swampy area here in the map. Thus, as the Greeks pursued the Persians fleeing back to their ships, many Persians died in the marshes until the Greeks pushed them right to the ships themselves. Supposedly, the Athenian dead numbered only 192, while the Persian dead were 6,400. The dead were buried where they fell, which was actually a unique practice in Greek religion, and a monument mound was erected only later. An inscribed casualty list for the Battle of Marathon is extant and lists each Athenian casualty according to their place of birth. Now, some had actually claimed that at Marathon, members of the famous Achaemenid clan had wanted the Persians to win. They had flashed a signal from Athens to the Persians after the battle, letting them know that the city was prepared to surrender. Herodotus, however, pours cold water on this rumor. The historian indignantly denies the Achaemenids' involvement in such a scheme. Now, the origin of the Marathon race is related to this Battle of Marathon, and Herodotus, his is not the only version, tells us that as the Persians sailed around Cape Sunion, the Athenians marched back to defend their city as fast as their feet could carry them, and got there ahead of Darius. Coming from the sacred precinct of Heracles in Marathon, they pitched camp in Kunosarges. This route is the origin of the race, and because of the heroism of the Athenians, the Persians sailed their ships back to Asia. This was the end of the First Persian War, the Battle of Marathon. In the intervening period of 10 years between Darius's defeat in 490 and the second invasion by Xerxes in 480, many interesting and important events occurred. The hero of Marathon, Miltiades, actually was given some ships by Athens to continue the war efforts and earn them money. Then he was tried by the assembly and made to pay a heavy fine. He died before he could pay, and his famous son Cimon ended up paying his debt. The Spartan king Cleomenes defeated his arch enemies the Argives, but then goes mad and dies. One of his old rivals, King Demaratus, another king of Sparta, remember there were two, who had actually been deposed and removed by Cleomenes, fled to Persia and became a trusted advisor to the new Persian king, Xerxes. It's at this point that the archons at Athens now indubitably are chosen by lot from a pre-selected pool. This continued the diminution of the aristocratic authority embedded by the Areopagus Council. Also in this intervening period between the wars, the practice of ostracism is first encountered and implemented in Athens. Ostracism was an annual chance for the assembly of the Athenians to send into 10-year exile a fellow citizen. An ostracon was a broken piece of pottery used to inscribe votes. If one was ostracized, there was no formal accusation, no trial, no evidence. An ostracized person could return to his city and property after 10 years, and he was still a citizen. It was not a criminal offense. The first recorded ostracism was in 487 BCE. In 486, we know of a Megacles, who was an Achaemenid, obviously. In 484, Xanthippus, the father of Pericles, was ostracized. So why did the Athenians ostracize people, and why did it appear now, in the interim between the two Persian wars? There are a couple different possible explanations for that. One possible explanation is that it was a simple innovation to ward off the specter of tyranny. There was a danger that preeminent citizens would gain control of the state in a non-functional way. There also was the danger of the Spartans attempting to monkey with the workings of the Athenian government after their ouster of the Pisistratai, which had gone so poorly for them. It is also possible that it was not an innovation, but it was simply an old idea, and we just begin to know of it now. To ostracize someone, you needed a minimum of 6,000 votes in the assembly. This type of assembly vote had a special name. It's possible that previously votes were taken for ostracisms and people had their targets, but there just weren't enough votes to get it done. The very first ostracism we know of was a Pisistrate descendant named Hipparchus in 487 BCE, which gives you an idea about the types of people that got ostracized from Athens. Now we come to Xerxes' campaign in 480 and 479. Darius had died in 486 BCE before preparations for a second expedition had been completed. His successor, Xerxes, took 4 years to prepare his force. According to many sources, his force was some 2 to 3 million strong. This is unlikely. It's more likely that it was around 3 to 400,000, which was still over 10 times more than the entire united Greek force that could possibly muster. Xerxes, with his huge force, bridges the Hellespont, marches through Thrace and northern Greece, with a fleet moving alongside. Now back at Athens, around 483, a large vein of silver ore had been found at their mine in Laurium, which touched off a feud between the most prominent politicians and individuals at Athens of the moment, Themistocles and Aristides. Aristides wanted to use the money to divide it up against the populace, but Themistocles wanted to use it to build ships. In 482, Aristides was ostracized, and so ships it was, over 200 more to add to the formidable Athenian fleet. A little bit about the Greek trireme. The trireme was an oared ship with 3 tiers of rowers stacked on top of one another along the edge of the ship. The lower 2 tiers were not fully exposed to the outside. The trireme was light, fast, maneuverable. It was about 120 by 20 feet and could carry around 170 rowers. The bronze ram in front of the ship was crucial for its battle tactics. Each trireme wanted to disable the opposite ship by ramming it, and that was the goal. Athens was the main source of the Greek triremes versus the Persians, and this was to become a huge source of its later power. The trireme was later to become a symbol of the Athenian Empire and the power of her democracy. One of the first events in Xerxes' invasion was the Battle of Thermopylae. The Greeks had formed a Hellenic league to deal with Xerxes' invasion. Many cities had joined, but many of the cities that had joined were small. The key cities opposing Xerxes in Persia were Athens, Sparta, Corinth, and a few others. On the other side, the Greek cities that actually welcomed Xerxes' invasion were the cities of Thessaly, Thebes, to their great chagrin later, Argos, and numerous other small cities. These cities were considered to Medize. Mede is another name for the Persians. They were the ones that gave earth and water to the invading army of Xerxes. That is, they made a show of submission to the Persian king. Upon the approach of the Persians, the Athenians evacuated their home city of Athens and moved to Salamis and Troezen across the Argolic Gulf. At the Battle of Thermopylae itself, famously King Leonidas of Sparta and 7,000 men traveled to the Hot Gates, Thermopylae, to stem Xerxes' advance. According to Herodotus, a Greek traitor had revealed a hidden path to allow the Persians to come up behind the Greek defensive position. Leonidas dismisses most of the troops. Only 400 Thebans, some Thespians, and 300 Spartiates, Spartan warriors, remain with him. Leonidas and his party die a heroic death. After some indecisive fighting at the Hot Gates, a storm wrecks a huge number of Persian ships. Meanwhile, another Persian contingent tries to sail around the island of Euboea and come back up north behind the Greek fleet at Artemisium. This contingent, too, is wrecked south of Euboea in a storm. The oracle at Delphi had given a prophecy to the Athenians that a wooden wall would be their savior. It was the wooden wall that would protect the city of Athens. This oracle was interpreted by Themistocles as the Athenian fleet. The wooden wall was the Athenian fleet. However, by others at Athens, it was interpreted as the Acropolis itself. This was the backstory to the decision to evacuate the Acropolis. Disunity and self-interest were rife among the Athenians. The Peloponnesians actually wanted to abandon the whole of northern Greece and defend from the Isthmus of Corinth. Themistocles ended up bribing the Spartan commander to stay and fight at Salamis, and he tricked Xerxes, in his arrogance and his hubris, to join battle in these narrow straits. 200 Persian ships are lost, and Xerxes loses the Battle of Salamis. Xerxes retreats with his navy to the Hellespont and leaves his general Mardonius in Greece to finish the land expedition and defeat the Greeks. In spring 479 BCE, the Battle of Plataea is fought in Boeotia. The Greeks under Pausanias, who is the regent for Leonidas' son, remember Leonidas had died, field a force of 70,000 Greeks. This is the largest united Greek force ever fielded. The Greeks win a hard-fought land battle, and Mardonius dies. So the Greeks are triumphant in the Persian Wars, and a symbol of this triumph is the Serpent Column. Serpent Column is a monument dedicated by the Hellenic allies at Delphi after the Battle of Plataea. It sat in front of the Temple of Apollo at Delphi for centuries until it was finally relocated to Constantinople by Constantine the Great in 324 AD. In its inscription, it listed those polis who had fought against the Persians. It was on a column modeled as 3 intertwined serpents. The implications of such a monument are loud: glory and chaos for those who are on the list, and infamy for those who are not on the list. The Persian Wars were the birth of the glory period of Athens. And next time we're going to take a look at the culture and society of the classical Athenian period. Thanks a lot, guys. See you next time.